Good evening, everybody, and a very, very warm welcome to the launch of Historical and Sociolinguistic Approaches to French, and of course, a celebration of its dedication to Professor Wendy Ayres-Bennett. We're delighted that so many of you have been able to participate, and particularly pleased to see so many of the contributors to the volume, as well as a number of Wendy's former students, postdocs, colleagues, and collaborators. Just before we begin the programme proper, I'd like to thank the unflappable Cathy Collins at the Institute for Languages, Cultures and Societies for facilitating the bookings and the technology for today's event. And in terms of the volume itself, Mairi, Liv and I would like to thank not only the chapter authors, but also our anonymous peer reviewers, both at chapter and volume level, as well as Merrin Davies-Deacon, Emma Humphreys, Janelle Thomas and Sarah O'Neill, who between them translated, helped us with editing and indexed. And also Vicky Sunter, our editor at Oxford University Press, who was extremely supportive throughout the whole process. So thank you to all of you. As you can see from the outline that Liv has posted in the chat, we're going to begin with an introduction from the three editors, setting out the rationale for the book, and also explaining why we want to dedicate it to Wendy, although it will be very obvious to most of you, I would say. This will be followed by 3 short dialogues with some of the chapter authors. Wendy will respond, and at that point, we will open the discussion to other chapter authors and then to the rest of the audience. So please do contribute to that discussion in English or French, whichever is your preference. And on a practical front, could I ask you all just to mute when you're not speaking? And also, if you'd like to participate in the discussion and haven't completed a permission form, if you could do so, it's also in the chat, and send it to either Mairi, Liv or myself, and we'll make sure that it gets to Cathy. So I think that's it on the practicalities. I'm going to hand over now to Mairi, who's going to begin the introduction.
Thank you, Janice. So I'd like to add my own welcome to everyone. It's very special to see so many friends and colleagues here today. In a room full of specialists in French linguistics, it seems barely necessary to say anything about Wendy Ayres-Bennett. Her reputation as one of the foremost historians of the language precedes her. Just listing her publications would take me 20 minutes, and I could probably spend the best part of the next 2 hours talking about the breadth and depth of her impact on our field. So as we start this dedication and launch of the book, over the next 5 minutes, I'm going to highlight just some of Wendy's major contributions and accomplishments. At the core of Wendy's research is a long-standing interest in 17th century French. This runs through her publications from the book of her thesis published in 1987, through her pioneering historical sociolinguistic study of 17th century French published in 2004, to her more recent work on the remarks and observations genre, which has involved publishing her own digital and critical editions of Vaugelas's remarks, but also serving as the main editor for the 17th and 18th century sections of Garnet's Grand Corpus. Wendy's work on Vaugelas in particular, from the book of the thesis to the now authoritative critical edition, has gone a long way to ensure not only that Vaugelas is no longer plus célèbre que connu, as Bruno quipped, but also that the complexity and multidimensionality of his linguistic thought is fully recognized. From this core interest in the relationship between language, text, and society in 17th century France, Wendy's interests spread out in a number of directions. I point first to the work on the broader genre of the remarks and observations, with, in particular, the 2013 co-edited volume called Bon usage et variation sociolinguistique, which represents an important inflection point in the field because it placed French prescriptivism and metalinguistic texts in their wider cross-linguistic context, thereby in some ways calling into question the supposed exception française in this domain. Wendy also played a pioneering role in the development of the general field of historical sociolinguistics, demonstrating how to make the best use of what sometimes gets called bad data in her groundbreaking essay from 2001 and in her 2004 book. She's also had an impact on contemporary sociolinguistics, with both the 2018 Manual of Romance Sociolinguistics, which she edited with Janice Carruthers, and the 2021 Cambridge Handbook of Language Standardization, which she edited with John Bellamy, Wendy has demonstrated the value of adopting a comparative approach, something which remains all too rare in contemporary sociolinguistic research. One of Wendy's greatest contributions in recent years has been her leadership of multilingualism, empowering individuals, transforming societies, or MATES, a vast interdisciplinary project funded by the AHRC, which showed the value of languages in addressing the many and multiplying challenges of the 21st century. Most recently, Wendy, in part through MATES, has been working on language policy, both from a scholarly perspective, but also as an active participant in its development. This list of Wendy's interests, which I've kind of begun here, should be considered an open rather than a closed set, not least because she just received a Leverhulme grant to work on her next project. Wendy's stellar contributions have been recognized on a number of occasions during her career. She won 2 prizes from the French Academy, the Prix d'Académie in 1997 for the edition that she and Philippe Caron published of the Academy's remarks on Beaujolais Quinte Course, and the Prix Georges Dumézil in 2013 for the comprehensive study of the remarks and observations genre that she and Magali Segido published in 2011. Wendy was also recognized by the French state in 2004 when she was made an officier or officière dans l'ordre des palmes académiques. She's been invited numerous times to give guest lectures, keynote presentations, and for longer periods as a visiting professor, including at my own institution, UC Berkeley, in 2012. Today, as well as being an emerita professor at Cambridge and emerita fellow at Murray Edwards College, she's also become an associate fellow of the Institute for Languages, Cultures and Societies, our virtual host today. Before I hand over to Liv and then Janice, I want to close my introduction by underscoring the importance of Wendy's work for teaching. This is partly because I first met Wendy exactly 25 years ago, this fall or autumn, when I was in my first term at Cambridge, taking the structures and varieties of French paper. In fact, yesterday in my office, I managed to find an essay that I wrote for Wendy, dated the 6th of November, 1999, but I don't think I'm going to share the mark that I got with you today. Those lectures and supervisions with Wendy at Cambridge opened my eyes to a whole new way of thinking about French. And I especially remember the emphasis that she was already placing then, not on the center or the canon, but on variation and the less well-studied. Today, like many of you, I make ample use of Wendy's publications in my own courses. I've used Problems and Perspectives, Studies in the Modern French Language with my undergraduates since starting to teach at Berkeley in 2008. And all of the graduate students who have passed through the French department at Berkeley since then have become closely familiar with A History of the French Language through text. I remember one seminar where we'd read that book alongside a number of other studies by Wendy. And at the end of the semester, a student, I think in literature, came up to me and said, "I've worked out what Wendy does. She takes a binary, spoken written, descriptive prescriptive, literature linguistics, and calls it into question." This adding of nuance, recognition of complexity, and constant drive to rethink are indeed hallmarks of Wendy Ayres-Bennett's scholarship. This, I think, is what makes her work exemplary in both senses of the word. She sets the highest bar for scholarly work, but she also creates models, both literal and figurative, which other people can take up, build on, and apply elsewhere. I hope that you'll discover some of that happening in the scholarship presented in this volume too. With that, I will hand over to Liv.
Thanks, Mairi. Can everyone hear me? So I would like to highlight the fact that in addition to her outstanding research record, Wendy has throughout her career always championed women and early career scholars, both in her research and more generally as an outstanding mentor and advocate. As early as 1994, Wendy noted the lack of attention paid to the role of women as grammarians or linguists, and she began the work of changing this with her special issue of Histoire, Épistémologie, Langage on la grammaire des dames in that year. This special issue not only addressed an important question well before it became more widespread in the field, that of the invisibility and erasure of women scholars, but it also included articles from a number of women scholars who were, at the time, early career researchers, ECRs, and who are now eminent professors in linguistics, including, for example, Gabrielle Beck-Busse and Carol Percy. Wendy has always had the wonderful gift of being able to pick out and support those ECRs who are doing interesting work and give them opportunities to showcase their work. Wendy's work on including women has been a thread running throughout her whole career. She dedicated a substantial chapter of her 2004 book on sociolinguistic variation in 17th century France to a novel and detailed examination of women's language during this period, once again shedding light on a much neglected area of study and also opening up useful directions for further investigation. This was followed in 2016 by a British Academy conference with the title Distant and Neglected Voices, Women in the History of Linguistics, which Wendy ran together with Professor Helena Sanson, and which brought together a number of both well-established distinguished scholars, but also early career scholars to examine the role played by women in the history of linguistics in different linguistic and cultural contexts, both within and outside Europe. This led to the groundbreaking 2020 Oxford University Press volume, Women in the History of Linguistics, which was the first work to examine in a detailed and systematic way the contribution of women to linguistics across the world. The scope and extent of this volume was a formidable achievement, given the many challenges faced by researchers aiming to discover women's activity in the history of linguistics, including the difficulty of finding existing evidence of this activity. And the book continues the process of providing a more balanced account of women's contribution to the field. But Wendy's championing of women isn't restricted to her academic work. She has been a staunch mentor and advocate for me personally, but also for many other ECRs over the course of her career. From my own perspective, as a woman who had a baby during my PhD, perhaps not the best idea, and another during the precarious early career stage, Wendy was an amazing mentor, and her practical and sound advice really helped me to steer a path through what sometimes felt like an overwhelming maze. She's still always available if I need support. And whenever I ask her for advice, I know I can trust her to give me an honest, straightforward, and extremely pragmatic answer. Her academic feedback is also the most useful kind of feedback because it's so constructive. She always gets straight to the most important point, and in every case, it leads to deeper reflection and to higher quality work. Wendy is the best kind of mentor. She has continually championed me and many other scholars and our work, and she's the staunchest of supporters, but at the same time, she's always challenged us to produce the best work we can. I find it so wonderful that she's gone on to mentor some of my own graduate students, and I know that they find her support and advice as invaluable as I do. This mentorship of women and younger scholars has also been an important focus of Wendy's career. Although she began her academic career at Queen's College in Cambridge, it was actually at All Women's College Newhall, now Mairi Edwards, where she eventually found her home and where she supported and championed many cohorts of undergraduate women students to ensure they reached their full potential. Wendy has also always been extremely generous about introducing me to other scholars and sharing her networks. And this started even before I became her PhD student. While I was still doing my master's, I went to see Wendy to discuss doing a PhD with her. And she asked Mairi McLaughlin, who was doing her PhD at the time with Wendy, to meet me afterwards so I could, as Wendy put it, find out what she was like as a supervisor behind her back. That meeting not only reassured me that my PhD was in the best possible hands, but it also turned into one of the most enduring friendships of my life. The fact that Janice and Mairi and I have had such a great time working on this volume together, I think is testament to the fact that Wendy has provided me and many others, not just with academic and career advice, but with a whole personal and professional support system. We're all truly delighted to dedicate this volume to her. Now I'll pass on to Janice.
Thank you, Liv. So as three linguists who've been inspired, trained and mentored by Wendy earlier in our careers, it's perhaps not surprising that our collective research interests overlap with many of her own, such as working with historical data, unpacking language attitudes and ideologies, not least standard language ideologies, analysing questions of variation, exploring language contact between French and other languages, and interrogating language policy, not just in France, but also in other French-speaking parts of the world, as well as non-Francophone settings where French is a curricular language. However, we wanted the volume to be much more than a collection of chapters on this range of historical and sociolinguistic themes. One of Wendy's greatest skills as a researcher, and this has already been mentioned by both Mairi and Liv, one of her greatest skills as a researcher and as a collaborator is the ability to ask the really challenging questions, to problematize established analyses that are widely accepted, and crucially, to help develop the methodologies that allow us to take the discipline forward by approaching those challenging questions in innovative ways. This, by definition, involves a certain level of mutual enrichment between synchronic and diachronic approaches, most especially in the interdiscipline of historical sociolinguistics, which has been particularly productive in recent years. To take just one example, the recentering of the speaker in historical sociolinguistics has transformed our understanding of the language of a much wider social spectrum of speakers. Both speech and writing have been explored in a vastly expanded range of registers, text types, and genres. This, in turn, has enabled a much more nuanced analysis of elements of the history of French, and indeed of many other languages, that were based on a much more limited set of textual sources, written predominantly by one particular gender, from particular educational and social backgrounds. Researching the speech of earlier periods is a particular challenge, since we have virtually no direct evidence of earlier spoken language. The recentering of the speaker has thus required extensive use of indirect metalinguistic sources, such as remarques, grammars, and dictionaries, and a meticulous piecing together of a complex and sometimes contradictory body of evidence. The volume we're here to launch has emerged against this vibrant backdrop in sociolinguistics, historical linguistics, and historical sociolinguistics, all fields in which Wendy's work has played an absolutely pioneering role. One contribution of the volume will, we hope, be a focus on the pivotal question of data, both linguistic and metalinguistic, in this case, spanning a time frame from Old French to 21st century social media. We aim to problematize the data question, while at the same time demonstrating the capacity of new data to shed light on how language evolves. The data themselves in the volume include corpora of literary texts, historical texts, letters, legislation, conversational French, Twitter or X, Wikipedia, remarques, dictionaries, grammars, linguistic atlases, journals, and printed press. Some chapters involve bespoke corpora, compiled by the researcher for a specific study, while others draw on the large searchable digital corpora that have been developed in the last number of years. In terms of French, the linguistic phenomena discussed in the volume include syntactic elements, the syntax stylistics interface, as well as the syntax prosody interface, speech and thought presentation, and contemporary evolutions in the sound system. Several chapters draw on metalinguistic data, which of course are key to enlightening us about attitudes and ideologies, but also to nuancing the debate around contested concepts such as language, dialect, patois, français régional. We have also sought to incorporate both multilingual and comparator dimensions. These are connected but distinct dimensions, both of which are acknowledged gaps in sociolinguistics and historical sociolinguistics. In the book, this includes contexts where French is in contact with other languages, or where French is acquired as a second language, or where a comparator context underpins a new perspective on French. The multilingual and comparator dimensions have been particularly enlightening in the chapters relating to attitudes, ideologies, and policy, as we hope the upcoming dialogues will show. And finally, reflecting Wendy's support for early career researchers, the support that Liv's talked about, including, of course, the 3 editors when they were early career, which is longer ago for some of us than others, we very deliberately wanted to have a mix of established scholars and early career researchers in this volume. Though I would admit that even those authors who were early career when we started are no longer early career, and we started during the pandemic in 2020. I'm going to hand over now to Mairi for the first of the 3 dialogues on what we see as some of the major threads in the book. So over to you, Mairi, then, for the first dialogue, which is on new data, new approaches.
Thank you, Janice. So for this first dialogue on new data, new approaches, I'm going to be introducing 2 contributors to the book, who are also, in fact, 2 former PhD students of Wendy's. Anna Tristram, who wrote the chapter on attitudes on Twitter to French inclusive writing, and Thomas Rainsford, who wrote the chapter on proclisis and enclisis in early Gallo Romance. So Anna, could I ask you to get us started by highlighting just some of the new sources of data that are used in the book and explain the impact that they've had on our understanding of contemporary French.
Thanks, Mairi. It's lovely to be here and to see everybody brought together. So as other people have noted, as the editors have noted, one of the strengths of this volume is that it brings together research across such a wide range of areas in sociolinguistics and historical linguistics, but unified by the emphasis on data-driven approaches. And as you've pointed out in your introductory chapter, this is in terms of innovative uses of existing data, entirely new sources of data, as well as comparisons across time periods and across languages. And it's these perspectives which allow us to gain new insights on the French language. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of examples because we're limited on time, and I'm going to pass over to Tom in a minute, who's going to focus on historical perspectives. So in terms of innovative uses of data, in John Green and Marianne Hintz's chapter, for example, chapter 11, they return to a topic which was once very well studied, elision, and challenge some assumptions about it which prevail today. And it's their approach which involves actually focusing on or recording elements in transcription which are often edited out, such as intakes of breath, pauses, hesitations, and so on. It's this approach, this new data, which leads them to have such insights into contemporary French. Green and Hintzer also show that non-elision is variable according to register and personal style, and it seems to be susceptible to influences from grammar, lexis, and discourse coherence, meaning that it can't be confined within phonology. So it's this perspective that they have from their particular approach to data, which gives us these insights into the topic they look at. In terms of new sources of data, I'm going to mention my own chapter, which uses a corpus of data from Twitter, which I collected in order to investigate discourse around inclusive writing online. And as you'll all be aware, it's a venue for what are sometimes quite heated discussions. And so it's attracted the interest of academics from a great many fields, including linguistics. And one of the issues with data here is that we have access to vast amounts of data, but at the same time, we have some important caveats to bear in mind. Ethics here is a very thorny issue because this kind of data treads a line between public and private. And some of my former colleagues from Belfast will remember that I was snarled up in the ethics review process for quite some time on this chapter because of that grey area. And as with all online data, there's a limit to what metadata you can know about people. So if you're interested in speaker characteristics, with this kind of data, you have to be a bit careful because you don't really know that they are who they say they are, and there's a limit to what you know about them. And then there are issues with cleaning up the data. So what do you keep? What do you get rid of? What is noise, and what do you count and what do you not count? Nonetheless, this is quite an amazing opportunity to access large amounts of data relatively easily. So for comparisons across time periods and other of the perspectives we've got on contemporary French, I want to just highlight Ros Temple's chapter, where Ros is looking at putting data from the ALF alongside a close analysis of her own recordings from the rural Côte d'Or. And by doing this, she's shedding light on the question of levelling out of regional linguistic differences across France, which has been argued to be a recent phenomenon. But Ros in her chapter calls into question the standard narrative on the timing of the rise and fall of the Français régionaux. And she argues that at least in the northern half of France, the changes observed, which have been characterized as leveling, might in fact be better viewed as just as the continuation of a long rise and fall in dialectalization. So it's this use of data, the ALF data, alongside this new source of data that calls for us to revisit the starting point of this narrative about the Français régionaux. that was just a snapshot of a few areas where we've got new data or new approaches to older data.
That's great. Thank you, Anna. Maybe Tom, then, do you want to talk about the kind of historical counterpart? So can you explain, why we've had the diversification of the sources of data used in the historical work on French, and then maybe give us some examples from the book to explain the impact that this is having on our understanding of the history of French or of language variation and change more broadly?
Yes, thank you, Mairi. So it's well compared to working on contemporary French, it's well known that historical linguists we struggle with bad data, and indeed Sophie Prévost in her chapter reminds us of this, but she also reminds us that this is only if we try and compare it to what we have for the contemporary language. So the job of the historical linguist is always to make the best of bad data, and as has been highlighted in the introduction of the editors, Wendy herself has done a huge amount of work in this area, particularly in her 2004 book on sociolinguistic variation in 17th century France, in combining different kinds of sources to try to see how see variation in a past stage of the language. I think in recent decades we have got new sources of data, and data that's perhaps a little bit easier to search. Particularly, what comes out of the contributions in the book is the parameter of spoken versus written, more particularly comparing direct discourse or discourse within historical texts with narrative parts of historical texts. The idea being that we might see innovations first appearing in sections of text that are spoken. So Sophie Prévost, who's focusing on the rise in the realization of personal subject pronouns, is able to use a large past corpus of texts and investigates a number of parameters. Looking in particular at prose texts versus verse texts, non-literary texts, comparing subordinates and main clauses. But also one of the main findings is that these personal subject pronouns do get much more frequent in direct speech. And to show this quantitatively, we really need these large annotated searchable corpora. And in Sophie Marnette's chapter, she looks at, she highlights recent work on what's known as oral représenté, based on a pioneering article by Christian Markelonitzer in 2012. And she highlights a number of studies based on the Base de Français médiéval corpus, where you can also search by direct speech and non-direct speech, to show how we can see a number of phenomena developing first in direct speech. She also highlights a very interesting project, a new edition of the Histoire ancienne jusqu'à César, based on a number of manuscripts, and this too allows us to do this search between sort of direct discourse and narrative sections of texts.
Great, thank you, Tom. Do you want to say anything about then the approaches to historical data? You've talked about the kind of new sources of data. Are there new approaches as well that are being used in this book? We'll come back to the contemporary in a moment with Anna.
I thought a long way down about how to interpret this question. I think it's sort of a proxy for how do we do new things with the same old sources, because this historical data has by definition been around for thousands of years, right? And I'd definitely put my chapter in that category. I focus on texts in manuscripts that were all copied before 1130. So the data that my chapter is based on was well known to every self-respecting Romance philologist at the end of the 19th century. And indeed, the problem that I'm interested in, proclisis and enclisis of pronouns, this too was investigated in great length by Romance philologists at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So, why would we want to look at these old questions again is a question that I ask myself really quite often. I think there are some things. Firstly, we can, particularly when you're working on prosody or phonology, when a lot of work was done a very long time ago, and it's not that this is bad work, this is still fantastic work in its empirical quality, but phonological and prosodic theory has moved on in the last 100 years or so, which is reassuring. And being able to apply new theoretical approaches to older problems does give us insights that were just not available to these scholars 100 years ago, however brilliant they were as philologists. I also, we can now, using technology, we can create sort of multifaceted editions of text, so that we can have a normalized version of a text where the words are divided as we want them to be divided to search for things, but at the same time retain the diplomatic form of the text. And this is something that I really stressed in my chapter. I was quite interested in word division in the manuscripts, because when you're looking at linking phenomena, this is quite interesting, particularly in interpreting the spelling, or indeed in diacritics used in the manuscripts. One of the manuscripts I used, I was delighted to see marked stressed syllables with a diacritic on the vowel, some 500 years before I thought this phenomenon was actually invented. And also, the other thing I tried to do is look also at the whole of the Gallo-Romance area, not just texts that are traditionally associated as the history of French, because in fact, if we look at the very earliest texts, it's really a continuum, a dialect continuum, from the texts that were copied in the very north, in Picardy, to many texts that are in a sort of Franco-Occitan scripture copied in the middle, down to the texts that are purely Occitan. And they're all sort of individual witnesses. So by comparing them, we can find out much more about these earlier periods. And I'd also like to say a word about Bernard Combet's chapter. Again, I would say this is using data that's been widely available for over a century, and but he uses it to address an extremely new question, looking at how syntax interacts with information structure, particularly foreground information and background information, and how this evolves over the course of time, all the way from Old French to pre-classical French. Pre-classical French too, although the texts have been available for a very long time, is quite an understudied period in the history of French. It was very nice too to see new work here. And this is based on quite a traditional method. There's sort of the very close reading of these texts and a choice of selected examples, but it is such a complex question to try and see how hypertaxis, where background is always associated with subordination, is slowly replaced by parataxis, where you have sort of more descriptive sentences. It's linked to the rise of the imperfect as opposed to the passé simple driving forward the narration. I mean, this is, I really love this chapter. This is the work of a superb philologist, going back to the texts, reading them through, and highlighting things that I think, unless one doesn't know the text very well and read them through, it's really quite easy to miss.
That's great, thank you. So Tom and Anna, together you've really kind of brought out the two things that we wanted to think about in the volume: the new sources of data and new approaches to data. But Anna, this it's been a while now since we submitted the final versions of our chapters in 2021. So I was just wondering, for contemporary sociolinguistic work on French, is there anything new that's happened since, or what are you seeing now? Let's maybe kind of moving on from this volume as our sole focus. What should we know today, and what's on the horizon?
Thank you. Yes, it sure was a long time ago that we finished these, wasn't it? So the field is, of course, more diverse than ever, and it's impossible for me to summarise the breadth and depth of research taking place on French here. But just to give a quick snapshot of some key trends, new sources of data that I've seen on being used at the moment. As Tom was alluding to, this might be corpora of older texts, but they're increasingly sophisticated in their levels of tagging, which allows a more nuanced analysis. We've got ever larger corpora of speech with more coverage of regions. So, for example, the Corpus du français parlé de nos régions from the research group at the Sorbonne. which is quite prominent. There are other new types of data from various digital media platforms. So that I see there was a special issue of the JFLS in 2022, which was called French Variation in Digital Media. And in fact, quite prominent as well is crowdsourced data. So I'm thinking here of the work of people like Mathieu Avanti, where you just put calls out and get people to fill in surveys or log things, which of course gives you access to a vast range of data, but bearing in mind some of the caveats that I highlighted just now, and also perennially popular outside the academy. People love to respond to that kind of survey, so you do get quite a good amount of traction. And then there are other things like vast web corpora, things like Sketch Engine, which pulls together things from across the web. So a student of mine recently looked at the use of the very controversial non-binary pronoun yel on Twitter and also via Sketch Engine to see what people were actually doing, or whether people were using techniques for non-binary language. So as always, there are challenges to these types of data, as I mentioned above, but there's some very exciting things happening out there.
We should probably move on in just a minute to the next conversation, but I can't resist asking the difficult Wendy question to either Tom or Anna. Since this volume was published, obviously the tools of generative AI have been much more widely democratized. And I was just wondering, what can we learn from Wendy's responses to innovation and change in our tools and methodologies to help us deal with the AI revolution in linguistics? I don't know who wants to take that.
I'll start off and perhaps hand over to Tom. I think this is an area where AI has absolutely exploded into a number of domains, including linguistic research. But it's somewhere where we really need to remember that the tail mustn't wag the dog, because you can use this as a tool, but it doesn't mean that you should let it drive your research. And you also need to keep in mind always the principles and the very motivated philological approaches. So an example I could give is in handwritten text recognition. So this is something, AI is something that's being used to digitize and transcribe manuscripts in a very quick way. But alongside that, you have to keep in mind that you need to have the intimate knowledge of these texts and not abandon the philological principles. So extraordinarily powerful and helpful, but they can't replace the work of traditional philology or of sociolinguistics, indeed. I don't know if Tom wants to say anything more there.
I think probably we need... Is that okay,
no, I was going to say, no, I
think
think Anna's said it all, so...
Okay.
Thank you, Anna. Thanks both Tom and Anna for that revealing discussion. And Tom, I'm going to remember your question. Why would we want to do new things with the same old data? That's a good question to keep in the back of my mind. So with that, I'm going to hand over now for the next conversation.
Okay, so I'm going to move on then to the thread of multilingualism running through the volume. And I'm going to bring in two colleagues from the METS team. So this is the large HRC project, Multilingualism, Empowering Individuals, Transforming Societies, which of course Wendy led between 2016 and 2020. So two colleagues then are Dr. Mairi Davies-Deacon from Queen's Belfast, who was a PhD student on the project, and I think is one of two of Wendy's academic granddaughters to participate in these dialogues. So Mairi, and then also, so Mairi's chapter in the book is on corpus planning in Breton. And I'm going to bring in also Professor Nicola McLaughlin from the University of Nottingham, who led one of the MET strands and is author of a comparative chapter on 18th century bilingual lexicographers. So if Mairi and Nicola would like to come in, I'm going to start with Nicola. We think as a group of editors that multilingualism is a very strong thread running through the book. It is, of course, one that is highlighted very much in Wendy's work, both in her publications and in her leadership of METS. So, Nicola, could you start by explaining how we got here? What did French linguistics or linguistics more generally look like before the multilingual turn? So tell us a bit about the multilingual turn and how it has changed things.
Nicola, you're muted.
Sorry, I did press on mute, but obviously not beautifully enough. Yeah, great to be here and to be taking part. I guess in the old days, before the multilingual term, we were thinking in terms of national philologies very much. We each knew that we did French studies or German studies, whatever it was. And our role was to study the national language, its linguistic features, its cultural expressions, and anything that didn't fit into that dominant template just sort of got ignored, really. So if we saw something like code switching into another language, that was just kind of sidelined as irritating data, bad data in a different side of kind of not pure data. And then I think with the multilingual turn, it's interesting because I still sometimes see this phrase being misused, I would argue, to mean, well, we now in modern languages are much better at collaborating together. So we French and German specialists, we collaborate. And sometimes people genuinely think that that is part of the multilingual turn. Well, that's great. And, it's wonderful to embrace that. But the multilingual turn itself is much more profound than that. And the MATES project did that. It certainly encouraged collaboration, but MATES was living a much richer version of multilingualism, which is what the multilingual turn was about, which was about challenging that monolingual ideology that if it's not one language pure, we're not really interested in it. If it's not the language of the nation, that's not really what we can afford to be interested in. And I think the multilingual turn has made us think about the fact that we have linguistic repertoires that include varieties within a language, but also in many cases more than one language, that language is a resource that helps us get things done, and that we are fluid and dynamic and how we are using the language and indeed the borders between those varieties and languages. So quite an important recentering. And I think another dimension of it that I'm not sure as part of the definition strictly, but I think has been important, is a much more inclusive version of studying languages, so that we're not just studying the curricular languages, I think you called it, Janice, but much greater openness to a wider range of languages and language repertoires globally. And that's been reflected in some of the publications, like the work of Ingrid Piller on linguistic justice, or globalizing sociolinguistics, or Alison Phipps, decolonizing multilingualism. Lots of approaches that are not just about the multilingual term, but about the a kind of a recentering or a decentering away from particular dominant languages.
That's great, Nicola. That really sort of sets the context for some of the chapters in the book that have a strong thread of multilingualism. And maybe turning to you then, Mairi, could you talk to us a bit about multilingualism, if you like, within the borders of France, and how it features in the book? Obviously, thinking particularly of minoritized languages, thinking about policy in relation to minoritized languages, corpora, etc., but a bit about multilingualism within the borders of France.
Sure, yes, thanks, Janice. So I think the main thing to say about language policy as it relates to minoritized languages in France is that it's felt to be very insufficient, and that's probably the most obvious thing we can say about it. As you mentioned, Janice, in your chapter with Michal and Mannion, France is one of very few Western European countries not to have ratified the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages. So it's certainly seen as backward in that sense, in that policy sense, compared with many other Western European countries. And there have been these attempts to be more progressive, again, as you mentioned, Janice, which have often been blocked by this clause in the Constitution that la langue de la République est le français. So that is, of course, seen as this fundamental pillar, I suppose, of French society. And at the same time, we see that there are officially 75 langues de France. There is this recognition of this great richness of varieties, both OI and OC. and also other varieties, other languages like Breton, and of course languages that are langue d'immigration, heritage languages. So there's this this sort of paradoxical situation, I suppose, whereas there is this huge diversity of languages being used, but at the same time, very little recognition of that at a national policy level. And what we're seeing in terms of new speakers and the sort of emergence of new speakers as a perhaps not a category, but at least a lens through which to perceive certain speakers academically. Speakers are emerging who are making conscious decisions to learn these languages, which might not have been valorized in the past, which might not be still by older speakers. And so speakers are coming in with a very different attitude towards these languages. People who might be making a more explicit connection between language and identity, and who might be instrumentalizing their languages as a way of expressing their local identity in a sort of in a frame where globalization makes it more and more important, I think, to concentrate on the local. So what we see as a result of that is a difference in the perception of those languages in the public sphere, the need to include those languages in the linguistic landscape, for example, in education, people who are very forthright about wanting that to happen, and who are activists in favour of these languages. And we also see linguistic consequences as well. So that's part of what I looked at in my chapter on Breton. And this ties into Wendy's work, I think, on the history, the sociolinguistic history of French, because it's the same sort of processes being applied now in the case of regional minoritized languages that were applied to French 200 or 300 years ago. These processes of dialect leveling and standardization and conscious and unconscious influence on the languages. And the question, I think, that emerges now is, how do these new speakers have that effect on these regional languages? What do their attitudes do to the linguistic side?
Thanks, Maren. And what about multilingualism in relation to questions of identity construction and negotiation in multilingual colonial contexts? Because there's some coverage of that in the volume as well. Sure,
yes. I think that the new speaker paradigm makes this connection between language choice and identity construction very clear and very evident. But of course, that perhaps obfuscates the fact that it has always been there, particularly in these multilingual situations and these situations of colonialism. Cases of language contact, of course, have gone back as long as these people speaking different languages have come together. So there's always this choice to be made around which language is to be used. And of course, it's not going to be the same language all the time, which might speak to people's different senses of what it means to use a language as an individual, what that says about them and about the way they're positioning themselves in any particular context. And I think this is something that Janelle Thomas picks up on in her chapter on official correspondence in Louisiana, Spanish-controlled Louisiana in the late 18th century, where there was this sort of passive bilingualism. The opportunity, I suppose, existed to use both French and Spanish, and the people at the top of the hierarchy who were Spanish and Spanish-speaking were using Spanish, but the people below them were still using French in a way that asserted their identity as French speakers and as French people, but at the same time didn't necessarily mean they were opposed to the Spanish and to Spanish speakers. They were showing their allegiance to the Spanish crown still, but they were instrumentalizing their use of French in a way that allowed them to, I suppose, combine those two aspects of society at the time. So this idea, again, I think, of breaking down the binaries and showing that this association of one language and one nation, which we see in French language policy, is, of course, not reflective of reality.
Right, thanks, Maren. And back to Nicola. Maren's talked a bit about the question of regional minoritized languages in France and policy in that area. Could you talk a bit about the book's coverage of multilingualism across borders or in comparator contexts, and maybe talk a little bit about what the chapters that have addressed multilingualism across borders or comparatively on how they have shed some light on the situation of French?
Yeah, great. So I think there's 3 chapters to talk about here. So the first one is Helena Sanson's on multilingualism in Italy, and particularly on the learning of French by women in 18th century France, in a context where there was already that internal multilingualism between literary Italian that wasn't very much used, and dialects, but then also multilingualism with Latin, which some people had access to, but not everyone. And then the kind of Gallomania, which meant an awful lot of people were learning French, and in particular what that meant for women studying French. And I think there were 3 things that came out of that were really interesting to me. First was some of the discourse in this era of Gallomania about the fears that French is somehow corrupting or having an effeminate influence that is damaging to a preferred, more virile version of language, of Italian and other dialects. So it's like a kind of a misogyny of around the ideology of language. And we see exactly the same thing in the English context as well, where people are learning French. So that kind of the breadth of the frequency, the recurring nature of these tropes was very interesting to me. The second thing I think is the role of multilingualism, and it's really obvious, but it's important to restate it as a vehicle for translating culture, for cultural encounters. So for a lot of women, French was a means of accessing knowledge, accessing education, and then sharing and translating, sharing it through translation. And again, there's a kind of an extra multilingual dimension, because quite often they were translating through French from other languages. So Caminatura in particular is mentioned by Helena. And then I think the third thing that struck me about the chapter is and I think Helena brings it out really beautifully, is the space that translation gives women particularly to show a little bit of expertise, because, and this is certainly the same in the German context, women weren't really allowed to be experts. You couldn't have access to an area where there was proper expertise required, because that was men's domain. But women found a way of, in the kind of the power texts that surround a translation, to actually voice their own opinions and to show their own expertise in what Helena calls liminal spaces. And she talks about the shield of their translations, enabling them to have access. So that's one chapter that I think explores the importance of multilingualism across borders in a really interesting way. The second chapter, I guess I have to mention my own, which is the one on bilingual dictionaries and the kind of metalinguistic attitudes. And that kind of began as an experiment to me, thinking that so much work has been done on the ideologies of monolingual texts, monolingual dictionaries and grammars, but not so much about in multilingual texts. And I think there are various reasons for that. I think it's partly to do with the monolingual ideology. We're looking at the National Dictionary, not these other ones. I think it's partly about, these are just teaching texts, they're not interesting. I think there's a degree of that. Or an assumption that they were very derivative, and so they wouldn't have anything interesting to say. So I thought it would be interesting to revisit some of those questions about language ideologies and prescriptivism, but looking at bilingual or multilingual texts. And my starting point was a dictionary by Boyer, French, English, English, French, and 2 offshoots of that. One in German, Ludwig's Dictionary of English and German, which was the very first dictionary of English and German, although he still kept the French in, which was based on Boyer. And then another dictionary by Louis Chambaud in the mid-17th, yeah, that's right, some decades later, where it's a dictionary of French written in England by by a teacher of French. And the results, I guess, are kind of contrasting. Ludwig was acutely aware of the pronunciation of English pronunciation, which the English were all absolutely obsessed with as well, but he was already obsessed with that in 1706, but not actually that interested in the ideologies of correctness, really, much more pragmatic approach, whereas Louis Chambaud is really heavily ideological in much of what he says. He's got an elaborate metalinguistic labeling scheme. Things are vulgar, things are obsolete. So there's all of that, the kind of the actual metalinguistic labeling, but also in his attitudes and what he says about who's got the authority to teach French properly, whose pronunciation is acceptable. So the Swiss speakers of French are obviously completely unacceptable, was one of the his take-home messages. And I think there's probably much more to explore in these kind of cross-border multilingual pairings. We had a panel on this at the most recent ILCS conference in Tbilisi, and we're going to have another panel at the Henry Sweet Society next year in France. Because I think there's so much to do with those texts, and talking about kind of new sources of data, they are much more accessible than they used to be. They've been digitized. AI still can't read them because there's too many different fonts, but they are digitized. There are lots of new research questions that we can apply to them now that we are actually being more conscious of multilingualism in the past as well as in the present. And then the final chapter I want to talk about, obviously, is your chapter, Janice, and Mihal's on minoritized languages in France and Ireland, policy, practice, and reality. And what I really liked about that chapter is the comparative dimension across France and Ireland, which I think really shows the value of comparing, because you see different things. It's very easy to default to something being a particular way the world is if you don't have that comparative perspective. And I found it really helpful having the two cases next to each other. So on the one hand, we've got France with its failure to ratify the Charter, as you already mentioned, Mairi, of regional minority languages, but a kind of a grudging recognition in 2008 that they're part of the patrimoine, at least, and maybe even part of the Trésor National, but still relatively weak politically, compared to Ireland, where legislatively and from a political perspective, Irish looks like it's doing really well. It's really well supported in terms of the legislation. Ulster Scots also has some recognition, and Irish is sort of accepted as is the national language in Ireland. But nevertheless, in reality, in pragmatic terms, what's actually going on, so there's the policy and then there's the practice, the pragmatic presentation of Ireland as a English-speaking country, all the more so, one within the EU, now that silly old Great Britain isn't. So there are different legislative contexts, but actually Irish is quite relatively weak, as you were saying in the chapter, Janice. And I found it useful to apply that distinction that's made between revitalization of language that might happen through education and be relatively successful, and regeneration of the language and actually extending that to different domains so that the language is not merely not dead, but is actually being used. And then just the final thing on that chapter that I'll perhaps bring out briefly is what Mairi also mentioned, the importance of new speakers. In kind of supporting the vitality of minoritized languages, and how that can lead to quite difficult conversations. And again, we come back to questions of ideology about who's a legitimate speaker, whose language is correct or at any rate acceptable, and what counts as authentic. And all of these are kind of the endlessly fascinating questions that underpin so much lay linguistic commentary on the status of languages. So that's a little something on those three chapters.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Nicola. Thank you, Mairi. And I'm going to hand over then to Liv for the final dialogue.
You're on mute, Liv.
You'd think I would know about this by now. I was saying thank you, Nicola, because that brings us on very neatly onto the third conversation, which is focusing on another main theme of the book, which is language attitudes and language ideologies. This conversation features one of myself and Nicola's former PhD students who has actually gone on to work with both Wendy and Janice, Emma Humphreys, who wrote the chapter on comparing the prescriptivism of 19th and 21st century language experts in France, and one of Wendy's longtime collaborators, Philippe Caron, who wrote the chapter on France and its difficult relationship with foreign languages. So I'll start with you, Emma, and very basic question. Can you tell us a bit about what language attitudes and language ideologies are and why they're such an important topic in linguistic research today?
Yeah, funny you should ask that. Yes, I can. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. This is, I think, a really important starting point because very often these two terms are used almost interchangeably. Ideologies can influence attitudes, and they can be studied together, but they're not the same thing. And a real strength in the opening chapter of this volume is that it takes the time to show this. So I wanted to draw on that now. Language ideologies, the editors write, consist of sets of beliefs that are shared throughout a community whose ideological nature is often disguised because the beliefs become naturalized to the point that they're viewed as common sense. So ideologies are something which are shared throughout groups of people and which are often taken to be common sense truisms, just completely normal ways of thinking. I'd add to this too that much discussion has also centred on how conscious or not we are of language ideologies. Often they can work below the level of consciousness, furthering this naturalisation. Language attitudes, on the other hand, and again, I quote the editors, exist not only at the level of the community, but also at the level of the individual. And they include feelings and behaviours as well as beliefs. The individual level is important here because whilst attitudes may be in some way cultural, shared with people with similar backgrounds, this is not always the case. Personal experience can also be really important. An example I often give when talking about this, in the UK, on a societal level, the Newcastle accent is often judged to be friendly and warm, and this is a shared attitude. However, if you absolutely despise the TV presenters Ant and Dec, who are both from Newcastle, then that personal feeling may well influence your attitude towards the Newcastle accent. And this highlights another important aspect, that language attitudes are rarely about language alone. So both ideologies and attitudes influence and affect how we view language, how we use language, and how and if, I suppose, we judge the language use of others. And this, of course, is what makes them so important in linguistic research, particularly when we consider that question of awareness. If we're unaware of a belief, this affects our ability to be critical of it. And this is important on a macro level when we think about language policy, which is influenced by attitudes and ideologies, beliefs about how language should be. And Philippe Caron's contribution is a really great example of how language attitudes, and in his case specifically attitudes towards language learning and lexical borrowings, how they influence and affect language learning policies, broader societal attitudes towards language learning, and perhaps inevitably, but certainly unfortunately, attainment in and motivation for language learning in France. In sum, then, language ideologies and language attitudes research reveals those ideas and beliefs that often go otherwise unquestioned outside of research. And as I've tried to hint at, concern much more than just language alone.
Thanks so much, Emma. To follow on from that, until very recently, really, research on language attitudes tended to be strongly empirical and focused really mostly on the contemporary. So can you use some examples from the book to show us how we can do research on language attitudes in the past?
Absolutely. As you've said, and as was said in the introduction, historical linguistics as a discipline has been around for a very long time, but an interest in historical sociolinguistics and the attitudes of historical language users is much more recent. There's now a really vibrant canon of research on historical attitudes in French, to which, of course, Wendy has made a hugely impressive contribution. But there are also some excellent examples of that in this volume. These contributions not only show the worth and the value of these studies, but also demonstrate the many different ways in which we can access historical language attitudes. The challenge, of course, being that the language users we're interested in aren't there to ask directly. To focus on two methods in the volume for examining historical language attitudes, we have the study of metalinguistic texts, as shown in your chapter, Liv, and in Mairi's chapter. Mairi looks at the presence and representation of women in the Journal de la Langue Française, which is a periodical which is in a question and answer format, which was published in the late 18th century. It was the first, in fact, to be dedicated to discussing the French language. And through analysing the letters written by women and the editor's responses, Mairi is able to access the attitudes of women, which are an understudied demographic in research on metalinguistic texts, as we also said in the intro. and representations of women and women's language in the 18th century. A second method for accessing historical attitudes is through looking at language policy and planning decisions. So I'm thinking here, for example, about Philippe's chapter again and the status of languages in education, and also Doug Kibbe's contribution. Kibbe's chapter is an excellent tour of attitudes in France to the different language varieties of France. Kibbe traces the history of terms for Gallo-Romance, showing how they've changed and the attitudes which have influenced or followed the terminological trends. Of particular importance in this chapter, I think, is how it demonstrates the importance of looking at the historical and the contemporary together. Through understanding historical attitudes and the related policy decisions in this case, we can much more clearly understand where we are now and attitudes now. My own chapter similarly compares across time, but I look at just two time periods, so the 19th and the 21st century, and I compare attitudes expressed in two language advice publications. The comparative element in this instance shows which attitudes have remained stable over time and which have evolved or disappeared completely. What we see then from these contributions is not only the diverse ways in which we can access historical language attitudes, but similarly the benefits and the value of both synchronic and diachronic comparison and the use of historical data, as bad as it may be, the importance of that too.
Thanks so much, Emma. You've just been talking about Karen's chapter on policy and also Kibbe's chapter on naming language. So, Philippe, could you tell us a bit about why ideology is important in areas such as how we categorise languages or how policy decisions are made? Philippe, you are on mute. Yeah, perfect.
Does it work now? Thank you, Liv. I'm delighted to pay tribute to Wendy's huge academic activity and career. I think Emma has already answered to the question of the influence of ideologies in language attitude. I will just point out some striking examples in our book. But first of all, one cannot understand a good many articles of this book without mentioning Richelieu's guidelines, or so to speak, macro ideology for the creation of the French Academy. Whatever the latter's passivity through the 17th century, he drew an ideology of the French language, according to which the general practice of the population, whether lawyers in courts, priests in pulpit, writers and poets, was false. To a certain extent, I think the normative move of the following decades and centuries is an endless variation of that initial theme. First, Douglas Kibbe illustrates this continuous drift, which reduces the different regionates of Gallo-Romania to a statute of patois, that is a highly stigmatized linguistic practice, which the French Revolution will assimilate to conservatism and superstition. Although the Romantic 19th century marked a certain turning point with regard to the authenticity of regional dialects, the dominant position remained fiercely opposed to the role of dialects in public life. Second, Liv Walsh, Mairi McLaughlin, and Emma all deal with the influence of ideologies in the way people handle their native language. Between Domergue's Journal of de la Langue Française and the modern linguistic columns, the Courrier de Vaugelas continues a tradition of remarqueurs who testify to a constant feeling of linguistic insecurity. All these documents have a common starting point, a question of acceptability. Of course, as noted by Liv and Emma, Part of those observations may have a descriptive side, but one cannot deny that the general aim of those collections of remarks is prescriptive. They all suggest that there is, within the French and Francophone population, a strong feeling that their own intuition and their own dialect may well be a trap in their current practice of French. I have myself experienced that feeling in the early 80s of the past century when I arrived in Limoges as associate professor. When I said at that time that I was specialized in French, some people immediately replied, "Oh, moi je parle mal," with an accent of guilt in the voice. Things have changed ever since. People do not seem to be as concerned by normative prescription as they used to be, and that's all.
Thanks, Philly. I think some people are still fairly concerned by it. The field of language attitudes and ideologies is very vibrant currently, I think, as is reflected in this book, actually. Could you share some ideas about what has yet to be addressed in the field? So what do you think scholars should work on next?
Okay. The importance of ideologies in French is still astounding. What fields? First, in France, the European Charter for Regional or Minority Languages has not yet been ratified, as you know, by the Parliament. There's, of course, an underlying Jacobin ideology which sees a second regional or national language as a danger. As I have noticed in my own article, there's a link between this reluctance towards regional dialects and the fear of English borrowing. No country more than France, I guess, has promulgated a whole set of laws and decrees to prevent the use of foreign neologisms in administration and official situation. Moreover, I also showed in my article that the French attitude towards foreign languages was responsible for the bad marks France obtained in the last 2017 European inquiry about the teaching of foreign languages. Unfortunately, we are not the last. Britain is the last, but we are just before Britain, which is not really honorable. There's still a lot to work on about reforming the spelling of the language. On the one hand, the power of conservatism is responsible for the strange immobility of French orthography, which is deemed the Kamchatka of intelligence and politeness. La Belle au Bois dormant has been asleep since the 19th century, whatever the efforts to wake her up. The last 1989 reforming movement ended up with a pitiful collection of minor correction. No major change has been undertaken. On the other hand, many people complain about a decreasing interest of the young generation for mastering the rules of spelling, to the point that teachers have been urged by their authorities to judge ideas more than orthographic correction for the baccalauréat. Je conclus en français. En résumé, sur le terrain du prescriptivisme et sur les mentalités qui bloquent à la fois l'apprentissage des langues étrangères en France et l'adaptation de l'idiome aux défis de l'internationalisation, il reste encore un long chemin qui nécessite moins d'arrogance et beaucoup d'efforts. Mais je voudrais également ajouter tout le travail et tout le chantier actuel d'une histoire de la langue française qui n'est plus from above, mais qui est from below, et indiquer par exemple le travail que nous faisons actuellement à Poitiers sur la correspondance de femmes, les correspondances de femmes du XVIIIe siècle, dont l'éducation est particulièrement mal assurée dans les couvents, ce qui donne par conséquent des exemples de French from below. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Philippe, and thank you to all of the contributors to the volume who took part in the dialogues today. I think it's now time to finally allow Wendy to take the floor. So I will pass on to Wendy now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Liv. Hello, everybody. It's I feel like, in a way, after those opening eulogies, that I must have sort of died and somehow gone to heaven, and that I'm observing all this from some remote place where I can hear the angels singing. But I'd like to start by thanking, of course, all the speakers today, but as well as all the other contributors to the volume. I think most of you are present, and I want to say directly to you that I treasure each and every chapter. I'd also like to thank the many colleagues here from actually across Europe and indeed beyond who have joined us today. I'm really pleased to see you, if only virtually. I wanted to start by indulging in a bit of autobiography. Two great scholars started me on my academic journey as an undergraduate. Bobby Robins, R.H. Robins, for the history of linguistics, and Peter Ricard, who was part of the long tradition of research and teaching on the history of the French language in Cambridge. But I wanted also to pay particular homage to some inspirational women, notably Rebecca Posner, my DPhil supervisor, Ruth Morgan, Claire Blanche-Benveniste, Christiane Motialonizia. I could go on. As you've heard, it's not by chance that my Cambridge College is for women students only, and that one of my major research themes has been women, gender and language, bookended, as you've heard, by that special issue of Histoire épistémologique du langage and the OUP volume with Helena Sanson in 2020. And in that volume, we argued for the importance of looking for women's contribution to the history of linguistic thought and scholarship in less obvious areas, including in translation and cultural mediation. And that's something that Helena does in the chapter in the new volume. And Mairi, in her chapter, as we heard, shows how already in the 18th century, Domergue's journal offered a space for women to participate publicly in metalinguistic discourse, giving that work a certain democratizing value. But of course, above all, heartfelt thanks go to the three editors who somehow, and I don't know how, managed to keep the volume secret until it was very, very far advanced. They are also three strong women with exemplary careers whose research and scholarship is a source of great admiration and pride to me. So I've been asked to respond, so I'm going to start by trying to say something about each of the three themes, and I'll take them in each or in the order. So I'm going to start with try to say something about new resources. And yes, we definitely need more corpora which are philologically informed, like Tom Rainsford's old Gullah-Romance corpus. What I wanted to say is that we need these philologically informed corpora, not just for the medieval period where they are beginning to flourish, but also for other periods. And I wanted to just mention here the Grand Corpus des Grammaires Françaises, des Remarques et des Traités sur la langue, on which I worked for Bernard is present many, many, many years. And that corpus includes facsimiles of the text alongside a diplomatic edition and a lightly modernized version, so that phenomena like marginalia can be studied as an integral part of the text. On the new types of text, whether it's historical journalism, official correspondence, or Twitter, all of these are challenging that oppositions, one of those simple oppositions between written and spoken French. And that's allowing us to produce new accounts of the history of French, which are foregrounding the oral alongside the written. We need more diversification of informants and speakers, more different contexts and different communities, including comparative work across lesser-known Francophone communities. We definitely need greater homogenization of the tools and categories used in corpora, one of the things I'm currently working on is genre categories and the spread of linguistic change. And until we get some homogenization or greater clarity on those, studies of diachronie langue are going to be challenging. And as we've heard, more work is necessary on those neglected periods. It seems to be a long time that we've been talking about the 19th century as being neglected. Français très classique as well. And that's great that there's a chapter by Bernard Combet in the volume on that. And again, it's a period on which I've worked with Philippe and others for a number of years. I think the volume gives us lots of hints about the new approaches and exemplars. We just need to carry on marrying theoretical and linguistic and philological approaches, as Tom does in his chapter. That's partly why I have this very weird title of Professor of French Philology and Linguistics. We need to bring together the macro and the micro and the interplay of linguistic and sociolinguistic factors, as Sophie Prévost does in her chapter. And you've heard that that's been a major preoccupation for me, culminating in the 2004 volume. And of naturally of quantitative and qualitative data, as John Green and Marianne Hintzer do in their chapter. We're also well placed to bring together and integrate in the UK the best of Anglophone and Francophone scholarship. And I think Sophie Marnette shows how well that can be done in her chapter. Now, you've heard that I don't like simple dichotomies, and I think we just need to carry on challenging these. And I think new possibilities are being opened by third wave sociolinguistic approaches. And these notions such as repertoires. We don't need to talk, this is something that Ros brings out very well, we don't need to speak any more about this is a speaker of dialects X or of regional variety Y. We can talk about the linguistic repertoires. And we're seeing, as we've heard, this parallel approach of the promising rise of speaker-centered approaches in historical sociolinguistics. I don't know much about AI, but I do hope that it's going to help us with building an outillage of corpora. And although it won't solve paleographic problems, it might help us to do the first steps. There's always going to be a need for post-editing and post-production, as we know, in interpreting and translating work. Now, on multilingualism, MITE's had a transformational impact on my work, putting it into a multilingual context. And I'd like to thank all the MITE's team, some of whom are here today. That led, as you heard, to the publication of 2 volumes with CUP, one with John Bellamy on linguistic standardization and the other with Linda Fisher on multilingual and identity. And in both of those, we tried to advocate for a multilingualism as resource rather than a multilingualism as problem approach. And that's something which has really dogged a lot of political thinking over past decades. In 2014, there were 2 influential volumes on the multilingual turn in education by Conte-Meyer and May. And in these, languages are seen as embodied and a part of a multimodal repertoire, as socially constructed based on power and ideologies. And we've heard about the need to move away from the simple construction of languages as bound and discrete entities, recognizing translanguaging and the complex speaker repertoires that most speakers in the world have, or all speakers in the world have. But that's particularly important in the French context with its strong centralizing politics and promotion of metropolitan standard French. And if I can mention, in our recent Handbook of the French Language, Mairi and I really tried to embed consideration of multilingual context, whether variation within France or in the broader Francophone world. Marin's study of corpus planning for Breton caught in that tension between purism and the need for innovation, which is so often the case in France, demonstrates the importance of language policy and planning for the langue de France in particular, and for supporting multilingualism in general. In our 2018 volume on Romance Sociolinguistics, Janice and I noted the relative lack of comparative sociolinguistic studies and the urgent need for this gap to be remedied. And if you want an example of good practice, look at Pop Black&L's chapter in that volume. Already in the 1980s, John Joseph pointed out the benefits of what he called comparative standardology. We still need more work of this kind on the model of the chapter by Janice Carruthers and Micheál Mannion, which compares the French and Irish situation. And that's going to help us also to make better the case for constructive language policy based on research-informed evidence. We've heard about the parallel multilingual turn in the history of metalinguistic texts, and that's really well illustrated by Nicola and Helena's chapters. What's been the case in the French context is there's been very much a separation, I think, between those working on monolingual text and those exploring bi and multilingual text. They have different societies, for instance, and this work really needs to be brought together if we're going to enrich accounts of the history of French and take account of the multilingual reality of the past, which has so often been effaced in the traditional histories of Western European languages. Thirdly, then, attitudes and ideologies. Well, these are obviously central to our understanding of the French language past and present, because, put simply, languages don't exist without their speakers and the way they think and behave. And as you've heard, my work on history of standardization of French has been concerned with prescriptivism, purism, questions of authority and linguistic ideologies, right from my DPhil thesis on through the work with Magli Sejidou on the Remarqueur and my searching for continuities of their work in the 20th and 21st century chronique and other prescriptive texts. And Liv Walsh's chapter develops this work, demonstrating apparent softening of prescriptive attitudes in chronique over the 20th century. Although, as she concludes, there is still a lot of work to be done as to how these are actually read and interpreted by readers who have what appears to be this innate tendency to know what is right and wrong in language usage. The internet has opened up new possibilities for more and more of the public to participate in language debates, thus blurring this traditional line between experts and readers, and Emma shows that beautifully in her chapter. One of the key themes running through the book is the importance of being attentive to meta-language. And Doug's Kibbe demonstrates this in looking at that nexus of terms, langue, dialect, idiome, parler, and patois, with their differing degrees of stigmatism, again echoing some of the issues highlighted by Ros in her chapter. And that's an excellent example of how the linguistic can't be divorced from the political, and the need for more interdisciplinary approaches to the history of French. Now, as you've heard, I'm now working both theoretically and practically on language policy in the UK, and that's been absolutely founded on comparative analysis with French policy. Philippe Caron's chapter on France's difficult relationships with foreign languages echoes many of the same reasons for reluctance to learn other languages, even where there's not the mitigating factor of the attraction of English, including the broader context and popular opinion. In their chapter, Micheál and Janice speak of the need for discourse planning and a better story about the value of languages. And there's also definitely a need for cross-cultural learning, something which we as modern linguists can, and I think have a duty to bring to the field of language policy and planning. And finally, I wanted to say that I'm a passionate believer in the value of French linguistics, not just to obvious cognate areas such as Romance linguistics or theoretical linguistics, but to French literary studies and indeed to French studies in general. And in that respect, it's worth mentioning Bernard Combette's chapter, which demonstrates the interaction between the evolution between Middle and Pre-Classical French of textual structures, the way they're marked, and textuality, and that can relate to the way a text is created or its narrative style. In other words, linguistic, discursive and aesthetic factors are closely intertwined. Also often in the UK context, French linguistics and French literary studies have been somewhat uncomfortable bedfellows, with littéraire not fully appreciating the work of French linguists, and I would say perhaps more definitely vice versa. I've tried to show how, for instance, the work of the remarqueur had an impact not just on the history of linguistic ideas, but also on notions of good usage and style. The symbiotic relation between linguists and writers in the 17th century is evident. Not only are many of the key authors of metalinguistic texts creative writers or translators in their own right, their examples display an immense knowledge of the literary texts of their age, whose authors in turn read and took notice of the linguistic pronouncements. The study of the literary sources cited by the remarqueur shows us which authors were considered linguistic authorities and models of style at the time. For example, the authors of volumes of observation frequently cite contemporary translations, but much less so the texts we consider to be the great representatives of classicism. To take an example, Nicolas Perron d'Ablancourt is named nearly 300 times in the Garnier numérique database of 17th century volumes of observations, while Jean Racine is mentioned just 37 times, and the references are mainly to his discours, not his theatre. The volumes of observations are also invaluable to specialists of 17th century French in providing information, of course, on the dating of certain linguistic changes. Their comments on the disappearance of certain verbal periphrases, for example, are valuable not only in helping us understand when these periphrases went out of use and to trace the modalities of their disappearance, but also to interpret their stylistic value in those literary texts where they continue to be used throughout the century. So looking forward, I'd like to see more collaboration between specialists in linguistics, literature and culture, leading to more interdisciplinary and more integrated approaches to French studies in the UK and indeed beyond. At that point, I'll thank everybody again from the bottom of my heart, and I'll pass over, I think, to Mairi.
Okay, I'll continue.
Olivia. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for that response. It's time to move on to a more general discussion. For the first part of this discussion, I'm just going to open the floor to the other contributors to the volume who haven't yet spoken. So if you guys can put your hands up first, please, if you'd like to say anything. And then after that, we'll open up the floor to everybody who's attending. You are all very welcome to pick up on any of the issues that we've already discussed, but also any kind of comment that you want to make about Wendy or how her work has influenced you is also very, very welcome. So I will ask people to raise their hands and I'll call on you to speak. Now I have to put the participants list up so I can actually see people's hands. Micheál.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much indeed. I just wanted to say that I would never begrudge Wendy a place in heaven, but I'm very glad that she has no notion of dying yet, Wendy. It's been, for me, my involvement with colleagues in French linguistics and in other areas of linguistics, particularly through the MATES project, has been a revelation, not least because of its interdisciplinary nature. You know, I learned so much as an academic from my collaborations with others. So I wanted to thank Wendy for that. There were things I believe I never would really have encountered fully without that experience. So thanks very much indeed, Wendy. And I'm delighted that you're continuing your involvement in policy work, because I think in terms of the outcome of METS, that's probably the most important thing for me. And you yourself alluded to the question of discourse, and our discourse in the Northern Ireland context has been so difficult for many years. It's really important for me and others working in this field to have colleagues in other places, not least in the United Kingdom and in England itself, working on policy in a way that will bring positive benefits, I think, to the UK as a whole. For too long, we are a place apart here, and we've seen that in the context of the loss of our local parliament for 3 years over what was largely the language question, ultimately, and to have collaboration across the UK and to be able to point to work of this kind across the UK and to the benefits of multilingualism, including Indigenous languages, is something that I think is very important for us. So I just wanted to thank you and wish you well with your future work.
Thank you, Micheál. I don't see anybody else's. Oh no, there's his hand up. Ross.
It's a while since I've been on Zoom. I couldn't find the hand. I've been sitting in the last couple of minutes trying to work out. I think I'm probably of those present the one of the if not the senior person to have been taken under Wendy's wing. Wendy was not my supervisor or overseeing me in that capacity, but I vaguely remember a paper back in a very, very long time ago when the Romantic Linguistics Seminar in Cambridge had papers in that beautiful panelled room in Trinity Hall, and my friend Mairi Parry, who I don't think is here, was waving at me to slow down because I was so nervous. It was my first ever paper. I think it was in 1988, and Wendy came and talked to me very sweetly about it afterwards, and then subsequently when I was doing my thesis, made it possible for me to stay in her house and with her kittens in the summer in Cambridge. So Wendy, well, there's been a lot more interaction in the years since then. So I'm very grateful for that, and I just wanted to share that in my senior position in that sense. But I also wanted to thank the editors. Anna made me laugh, saying that she got snarled up in an ethics review. My original plan for this paper was completely scuppered by ethics reviews. I was going to use indeed this platform, and you editors would not let me get on. So I can't think of anything else to do. I can't do it now. I can't do it. And you won't be aware, but I just sat and, well, Liv, I think it was you that said, well, I'm exhausted from the pandemic. I'm running away for the summer. So there you are. Here's an extension. Just write it. And I just sat and wrote. So thank you, because I thought I'd just write rubbish. And actually, this is it's a topic that's made me think a lot about how we categorize what we do. And it's interesting in the discussion that we've had. We've talked about Doug Kirby's paper, which of course I looked at on how people characterize and name linguistic varieties. But I've been reflecting just in the last few weeks on where did these categorizations come from for linguists? And I was reminded during this discussion of being brought up short by a paper given in Toronto by Shana Poplak, who I think was here. I'm not sure she's still here, which had the big reveal at the end was that we as linguists are as apt to be influenced by our own ideologies and attitudes about language categories as other people. And I think that is reflected in how we classify types of languages, but also how we approach the data we approach. And then Tom was talking earlier about bringing new theoretical approaches and analytical approaches to old problems, which, as we know, Wendy has led us in very many ways. And maybe my first experience of doing that was having struggled to make sense of some data from the Atlas-Linguistique de la France with heaps and heaps of paper and maps with circles on it, and then being told I could do that using statistical techniques, which led to the paper that I published very many years ago on that. But the other thing we need to remember, and I think that what's been said about Wendy's work, but also the work of other people here, that there's been a bee in my bonnet for a long time in all sorts of respects, is that we also need to bring the data, and particularly I work less in historical data normally, but we need to bring our old-fashioned understandings of the data as well to the new methods. I mean, this was brought up in part of the discussion, but since there's a bee in my bonnet, I thought I'd mention it. There are other things I could say, but I just wanted to share that this very morning, I was delighted to find, going through Romania, which is online, so it's really easy to get through JSTOR, that Gilles Laurent and Christophe Jaurès had a spat in 1888, I think it was, because Jaurès produced a description of the patois of Normand, what he called Normand. And Gilles Laurent wrote a review of it. I haven't had time to read these in detail, but I've just skimmed through them this morning, so I got very excited. Gilles Laurent said, "This is not a variety. It's not a separate, coherent variety." And Jaurès is defending himself and saying, "Yes, it is." And I thought, oh, great. This thing, I've been thinking, where have these classifications come from? But we have to go right back to those days. And as it's been said many times in this discussion this evening, maybe we can't. Maybe it's all more fuzzy than we think, which is not to say that we should all give up. Anyway, I've said too much, but thank you for organising this. And Wendy, here's to you. I only have a glass of water, but thanks.
Thank you, Roz. Would anyone else like to jump in and say anything? I guess I will now open the floor to everybody in the room, in the virtual room. So if you would like to say anything, please just raise your hand. The hand button, I don't actually know how you get into it.
There's a heart at the bottom with react.
Yeah. React.
And then
I think that's John Joseph there.
Wendy, congratulations. And all of this is so well deserved, and there will be many more tributes to come over the next 50 years before the funeral. And while listening to the talks, I have this habit of doing anagrams of people's names, and what I came up with for you is antsy between nerdy, which is a perfect description of somebody who does anagrams of people's names while listening to talks. But I do have a question. I was asked recently to give a talk about bad data, and I realized on one level, it's like St. Augustine about time. I know what bad data is until somebody asks me. It came up several times in several of the talks this evening. And I wonder if any of you could tell me, not necessarily now, but if you'd email me after to say what bad data means to you. Because for me, in one sense, it's idealistic or utopian to imagine that there's perfect data. But when you talk about bad data, I wonder what you mean. And if anybody has a comment, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
I'll jump in just really quickly. I can reply offline as well, but certainly in this forum, I was using it in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way because all data comes with problems, and I don't think it's particularly easy, as Anna said, to work on contemporary sociolinguistics, and suddenly the data there is all perfect and easy. In fact, both Rose and Anna talked about that. So yeah, I'm assuming in this forum that everyone would question that. But yeah, delighted to know that you're going to be thinking more about it.
I'm glad one of us is delighted.
There's a lot of messages in the chat. So if you want to look at those, Wendy, I'm finding it hard to see them, so I can't read them all out.
I'm reading them. Thank you, Liv.
Philippe?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'd like to give a striking example of comparative ideology. A few years ago, a Spanish student went to my seminar to complete a master's degree in linguistics. She was at the same time lectrice of Spanish in a lycée nearby. She came from Barcelona, where she had completed a BA in linguistic correction. Her father was Catalan and her mother was Castilian. When she arrived at the lycée, some teachers decided not to welcome her in their classroom because she did not have a good accent. But she was totally bilingual from her childhood. That experience proved that, in my opinion, those teachers had transferred their French ideology of the language to Spanish. But Spanish is, in fact, much more flexible. But she also told me, it's just a small example, she also told me that in Barcelona, her Tortosian accent had been stigmatized by her fellow students. They said, "How can you be so good at correcting while your accent is so dreadful?" Well, Catalonia has also gained strong prescriptive habits as well, it seems. It's just a small example. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. Would anyone else like to add anything? If not, I might add.
Yeah, thank you, Liv.
Sorry, Mairi, Veronique has her hand up, so I'm just going to pass over to her quickly.
Donc, je vais intervenir en français de Toulouse et dire merci à Philippe pour cette intervention sur notre langue nationale. I can say it in English too, because I teach English in Toulouse and I'm a teacher of French as a foreign language too. And I'm very pleased to attend this meeting with you. And what Philippe said about the stigmatization of accents and the lack of variationist perspectives in the teaching of English also in France is key to understanding the nationalism that we are suffering from in our country, because it's becoming very intense now. Thank you.
Thank you, Veronique. If we don't have any more people who want to make comments, and I can't see any hands raised, I'm going to pass over to Mairi. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Liv. Just a quick reminder before I close that if you took part in the discussion, if you spoke, we would love to have, or in fact, we need you to fill in a permission form. So Liv's going to circulate that again in the chat, and you can send it to any one of the three editors. Perhaps we'll pop our email addresses in the chat now as well. That's just people who spoke. I'd like to just, thank everyone for coming today, and give special thanks again to the contributors to the volume, and a special thanks to them for working on all of this through the pandemic, because I think we contacted most people in early 2020. So this work for everyone was done under harder circumstances than normal. But the final thanks obviously should go to Wendy Ayres-Bennett, without whom none of us would be here celebrating this volume today. So thank you, Wendy.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks again for everybody for coming, and it's been such a joy and a pleasure to share this time with you. And I don't know about the next 50 years, but I hope there will be very many long years of collaboration ahead. And I hope to see you all in person before too long.